Okay. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining this live chat. I'm Upendra from Institute of Public Health, and with me is Professor Andrew Russell from Durham University. And thank you, Andrew, for joining this.
You're welcome. No, I'm very pleased to be here.
And I hope that many of you were able to watch the video of his talk, which is now on the IPH website page, but also on Facebook and Twitter. So now, in hopefully for another 45 minutes or so, I'll try to convey some of your questions that I can already see up on live chat box, and for Professor Russell to address it. So before I go into questions, I'd like to maybe tell something more about the first edited volume called the Master Plant.
Oh, yes, The Master Plant. Well, The Master Plant was a book that came out of a meeting I had with Elizabeth Rahman in Oxford, actually. She's a social anthropologist. She'd worked in Brazil, and she'd spent a long time in the Amazon with her family, and was really struck and hadn't even thought about it, about how much tobacco was around there and how people were using it in a sort of daily way, not purely for recreational purposes, but also for sort of smoke that was supposed to protect babies and nurture crops, and generally used for all sorts of positive kind of reasons. And she was very struck by this. She was also very struck by the way people would often smoke tobacco in old newspapers and things like that, and was worried about the sort of health consequences of that kind of activity. But basically, we realized that there was a whole world of tobacco use in lowland South America that really was very much under the radar of sort of public health concerns, and actually was very different to the way that tobacco is regarded in amongst the public health community, sort of in the wider world. And so we had organized a symposium for anthropologists and other people who worked in Amazonia and other parts of lowland South America to come together and share their experiences of how the plant was used and what people's beliefs and attitudes were towards it. It was a very interesting symposium, and from that came the book that's been published. And,
It's interesting, really, to have this take of looking at tobacco plant having agency. And interesting. So we have a few questions from Vasant Kumar. And yeah, let me put this forth to you from his first remark. So you also mentioned in your webinar talk that the old world did not have tobacco, and can we sort of reimagine, dare to reimagine such world? And that's what I think he's prodding to. He says whether it is at all possible to eliminate tobacco from the face of the earth. If you have some comments on that.
Yes. I don't think it's necessarily fair to say the WHO is soft-pedaling on ideas about eliminating tobacco. Certainly a few years ago there was a big sort of eruption of interest in the idea of a world without tobacco, and there was various discussions in the journal Tobacco Control about different end game scenarios, as they were called, that you could imagine different countries implementing. And there are now a number of countries and regions of countries around the world which have pledged to go smoke-free or tobacco-free by certain sort of times in the future. And indeed, the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan is a country which has already declared that it's a tobacco-free state, and the sale and use of tobacco products are illegal there. So I think there's a lot of interest. It does seem to me it's become rather muted in the last couple of years after that sort of flurry of activity about sort of 5 or 10 years ago. And maybe that's because people are actually having to face the realities of what's involved in moving to that kind of situation of a world, if not without tobacco, without the kind of industries that are responsible for pushing tobacco products and for the health problems that are caused
he also points to this idea that well, the global tobacco control discourse is heavily about multinational corporations in tobacco, but in many countries, including India, where we are now, the government also supports and invests in tobacco at a scale, whether it is about giving financial and technical incentives to farming, tobacco farming, but also investing in tobacco companies who are manufacturing finished tobacco products. So, how do you see this? I mean, with public investment and public support, and what does it imply in terms of creating, say, tobacco-free world, or what does it imply for tobacco control?
It's a really interesting question and an important one. I mean, China is, of course, the country in the world with the largest tobacco corporation of all, and that is a state-owned corporation. And in many ways, people could become very despondent about the prospects for a tobacco-free future if they feel that the corporate and governmental sort of responsibilities and commitments are so tightly intertwined. But there are sort of political scientists working in the UK, and I'm thinking of somebody called Scott Hogg, who wrote a really interesting and sort of challenging article in the journal Tobacco Control a couple of years back, where he argues that actually you could see it as a terrible thing, but also it's potentially a promising thing, because once the state gets behind tobacco control, as there are indeed indications that happening in a serious way in China, then the potential to actually make major changes to how corporate sort of infrastructure is organized and products are sold, etc., is far greater than if you're dealing with corporate world that's essentially privatized. So I think it could be that doesn't mean state control doesn't necessarily mean the impossibility of moving towards a tobacco-free future.
And in some ways, maybe better opportunity to do that once the
more
state
leverage,
more leverage
from the government.
Yeah, that's true. We have a question from the Tobacco Free Karnataka forum, thanking you for the webinar, but then requesting you to share if there are best practices globally of rehabilitating tobacco growers or the farmers to other crops. Because the livelihood, I guess, in our parts, the livelihood remains a very major concern.
It is a very important concern. Yes. I'm afraid I come from a country which doesn't have a long history of growing tobacco, so I'm maybe not the best person to respond to those kinds of questions. But I know there are a lot of very good examples of crop substitution, alternative livelihood development in different parts of the world. And I think the WHO has been organising workshops and symposia, bringing people together to share those kinds of experiences. So I think we have to work to disseminate those kinds of practices. And indeed, I've had contact with people here in Karnataka, including Vasant Kumar Mysore Matthews, talking about the good experiences he's had with working with people, tobacco farmers, and finding alternative livelihoods. That it's not just a question of the income that maybe they get from tobacco, but it's also the circumstances whereby they maybe end up sort of financially, deeply in debt to the tobacco companies. So they have less freedom to maneuver and work to secure a sustainable sort of long-term future. So I think one has to look at it in a slightly wider way than purely on the kind of income
purely from the income perspective. We have Hussein asking, are multinational tobacco companies looking at getting into Gutka and BDs, which are Indian version of cigarettes, to which there is less resistance to tobacco in India? So apparently some of these non-cigarette forms of tobacco are probably more socially acceptable and also political politically acceptable. It's so I mean, I don't know whether you have any comments around whether do you see multinational tobacco corporations, the big tobacco, getting into that kind of markets as they move more, as you say, that they are moving their base towards LMICs, given the tighter regulations in some of the OECD countries. So if the markets are here, the markets are also highly segmented in South Asia, where you have huge markets for smokeless tobaccos or the biddies, and not necessarily machine-made cigarettes.
No, that's right. I'm afraid I can't really comment because I don't have enough knowledge about here in India. And I also don't think one should questions to the multinational tobacco corporations about directions that they might move in. But certainly the situation in India is a very complex one with regard to tobacco production. And there's a lot of, I think, important research that needs to go on into the nature of the BD industry and the Gutka industry to complement what we know, a lot more that we know about how sort of cigarettes are manufactured and made.
Yeah. Well, in fact, if I recollect in your edited volume, the master plan, you also talk about very many different uses of tobacco, but then when we see how global capitalist forces exploit tobacco, it's largely in form of cigarettes. So I'm just wondering, I always find it fascinating how you see tobacco as having an agency, and I'm wondering whether there are things to do with the products. The cigarettes, for example.
Yes, and there's certainly, it's very interesting the way that in some ways tobacco is almost shape-shifting into different forms as we speak. There's now a lot of work in the United States around the use of tobacco species as a form of plantibody, creating vaccines against Ebola, for example. And also, I'm thinking also of the way that e-cigarettes are now coming onto the market in some parts of the world, which are sort of non-tobacco but nicotine-containing products that in some countries are seen as an alternative to cigarettes and maybe a safer alternative. So there are lots of ways in which tobacco is changing its sort of forms, and we have to sort of keep abreast of these developments. So maybe we're talking not so much about a tobacco-free future as a tobacco consumption-free future or something like that.
Right. I think that's an interesting distinction to make, the tobacco consumption-free future and the tobacco-free future. We have Pragati asking, so in between the science, economics and politics involved with this master plan, how do we shift the balance towards science more effectively for even the remotest chance of world without tobacco? So what is really, what's the role of science in this, and whose science matter?
Yes, that's a very good question, Pragati. I think that as an anthropologist, I'm always very interested in those aspects of knowledge that don't tend to get kind of heard or listened to in the wider world. And so certainly there's a lot of potential for, I think, the social sciences to become involved in the kind of understanding of how people use tobacco products, how people find different kinds of tobacco, etc., etc. And I think that kind of information, where we're working with people and with tobacco users rather than sort of against them, is a really important sort of tack to take if we are to seriously imagine a world without tobacco. I know that in the UK, I work with, in collaboration with an organisation called Fresh Smoke-Free Northeast. That's an umbrella tobacco control organisation that's involved not only in smoking cessation work, but also health education and lobbying work. And they're always very adamant that their role is to be anti-smoking, not anti-smoker. And I think that's a really important distinction to maintain. We have to get sort of more people on board the tobacco control sort of agenda if we really are going to take things forward and get science, economics, and politics working together rather than against each other. It seems to be the case at the moment.
But I'm curious to understand that because what I see is that there is very strong tobacco control advocacy movements globally, but also in many countries. And the battle is getting just more aggressive because the industry is also sort of responding in a very aggressive manner. How do you then perceive, or how you and your work get perceived in this arena where your work is not all the time fully aligned with the agenda of the tobacco control advocates. I guess I'm just trying to create this artificial contrast, but the idea to say is that the way to look more holistically and broadly is different than when one is obsessed with pushing particular policies.
Yes.
So if you want to share any interesting sort of anecdotes or your own experience of how people do react to your work.
I've got a colleague, Simone Dennis, who works at Australian National University in Canberra. She used a very interesting metaphor about where she sees the role of anthropologists maybe as coming in, which is not so much to get involved in fighting the battles as to get involved in observing the war. And so we're looking at taking a sort of broader view of the war against tobacco, if you like, and trying to see where there's places in which the different sort of contenders in this war can actually come together, and where the war itself can come to an end rather than sort of more the details about the battles that people are fighting. Although I have every sympathy for the battle fighters as well.
Yes. You mentioned in your webinar about the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And we have a related question up here in the live chat box. The concern is that certain provisions of FCTC gets quite a lot of attention, be it pictorial warnings, be it smoke-free, etc., etc. While certain other provisions which have to deal with agriculture of tobacco, and I guess one of the provision is also about persuading the parties to sort of phase out tobacco growing, or at least reduce it over time and make certain commitments. And what we see in practice that these commitments are often not kept. So how has been your, you have been involved in FCTC processes.
Yes.
I guess you were in Delhi for the last conference of parties. So how do you see, that the FCTC, if at all, can become a powerful instrument in sort of containing at least the expansion of tobacco farming?
Yes, I think it's a very good point. I mean, a lot of the people who work in and for the FCTC come from a sort of public health background. So their particular specialities are in things like stop smoking campaigns, additive issues about educational sort of aspects, and they don't tend to have such a strong background in say things like agricultural techniques, which is why I think it is important to broaden out the stakeholders in the tobacco control field. I know that there have been anthropologists working in different parts of the world. I mentioned Pete Benson in the webinar. There's also somebody called Marty Otanis who's done a lot of work on labour rights for people working in tobacco in countries like Malawi, India, and other parts of the world. And their reports, have been very important in pushing the agenda of alternative livelihoods for tobacco within the FCTC. You're talking about a lot more than a simple sort of behaviour like smoking or chewing tobacco. You're talking about a whole way of life, and you have to take so many different things into account. the reports often, run on to 60 or 80 pages, which tends to be the kind of report that I think people working in the tobacco control field find rather hard to digest. And in many ways, it's easier to look at the consumption and demand side of the tobacco equation, and less at the sort of production
And I guess these arguments apply to many other constituencies. Just before a couple of days, we had a lot of protest in the city by the retailers association. They are worrying about their livelihoods. So yeah, I guess what you are trying to say is also a need for a broader stakeholder dialogue, and bringing in people from very many different constituencies who could bring inputs around those issues than just the public health. People.
On the retailers issue, actually, it's very interesting that with Fresh Smoke-Free Northeast, on the Making Smoking History Partnerships Board, we have a member who is himself a newsagent in the UK. A lot of tobacco is sold through newsagents in the UK. And he's committed to phasing out, the sale of tobacco products through newsagents. Himself being a newsagent, so he understands better than anybody the livelihood issues that involves. I also did a little bit of work in New Zealand, where there's been a lot of publicity given to shops that decide to go tobacco-free, basically because the capital that they have to invest in maintaining a supply of tobacco products and et cetera, just becomes too great, and the risks involved become too great, and they decide, actually, the future is tobacco-free, we don't want any more part of it. So I think there are some examples where retailers themselves can develop a kind of movement towards going tobacco-free.
Great. So I guess we are approaching 1 o'clock, and maybe we wind up now. So let me wish you well for your upcoming book, and if you want to share when the book might come up, and when is it that we get books in hand?
Okay.
How long it's
Thank you
going
very
to take?
much. It's hopefully will be published by the end of next year, and because I'm involved with a project funded by the Wellcome Trust called The Life of Breath, the Wellcome Trust undertake to make open access any publications that are coming out of through the auspices of that project. So it should hopefully be an open access book, and I'd like very much for it to be the start of a dialogue with as many people as possible about the anthropology of tobacco and how we see the future of this master plant, and how we're maybe going to try and loosen some of the powerful grip that it has in human life.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for joining us, and thank you all for joining us. Both the webinar video as well as the recording of the question and answer session will be available on YouTube channel of Institute of Public Health. Thank you for joining in.
Thank you.
Okay.